Okay, so we're going to go ahead and record our presentation today. We'd like to welcome everyone to our Lunch and Learn. Myself, I am Chris Looking and I am one of the program coordinators for Unit 23. Gail DeVillis is on also, and we kind of help work with our Master Gardeners and Master Naturalist program for Illinois Extension. We want to welcome you, and today we would like to welcome Sarah Lee. She's going to be presenting for us today on tree health. So we're going to ask everyone to remain muted and their video screen off, just to kind of let the connection be a little faster. So if you can shut your video down, we'll go ahead and do that. We do have a poll that we're sharing today, and the poll was, what was your favorite tree to add to your landscape? And 60% of everybody said oak. We know how beneficial those are to the landscape and also to all the other habitat that it creates. So we appreciate that, and we appreciate you guys attending today. I will say that this afternoon, or after this afternoon, we'll send you a survey, a brief survey about our program, and what you like to continue with the series. Any other topics you want to talk about or anything?
What did you do?
Okay, so Sarah, I'm going to go ahead and pull down ours to, I have everybody.
Mine, I started.
We can see yours. Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start then.
Yeah, we can see it, and I'm going to go ahead and.
All right. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Sarah, and I'm a master naturalist. I live in Mount Vernon, Illinois. I'm with the Jefferson, Bond, Clinton, Marion, and Washington County unit. And today, we're going to talk about tree health, assessing tree health on both young and older trees, and what we need to be looking for. So there's two spans of trees' life that we can evaluate them. And I like to say that with the young tree, you're looking for the musculature that will eventually make the old tree. And basically, these two spans of time then are when the tree is very young or newly planted, maybe in the past 5 years, we're going to say, for a new transplant. And then the second would being for the older, more established trees. And they're usually older than 5 years. So we're going to start out talking about the younger trees. So the first thing we want to do is select the tree. And the best thing to do is to look at the natural shape of the tree. When you find it in the nursery or the garden center, you want to take a look at that little tree and look for some things. I don't know if any of you have ever gotten a Christmas tree where it's got a bunch of cut off branches, and what they've basically done is gone in there and cut a older Christmas tree back so that it will look like, like a cone shape, so you'll be happy with the look of that tree. Well, that's one thing for a Christmas tree, because it's dead. You know, it's not going to be growing anymore. But this can be devastating when you're talking about a young tree. So what you're going to look for is if you can see where the garden center workers might have gone in and just sort of taken their pruners and cut that little tree back so that it'll look good, and taken off larger branches that are sticking out and don't add to the shape of the tree. So that's actually a type of a heading cut when you see that, or in many cases it's just a severe pruning job where the very, very large branches have been taken off. So you want to take a look at that, and then ideally, if you could find a tree that's been grown locally or in a certain climate that's similar to the one where you're going to be planting it, well, that would be very good. But do be aware that there are many garden centers who don't grow what they sell. And then there are also nursery garden centers that do grow what they sell. And then there's a combination. So if you're in doubt, just ask them, did you grow this here? And they'll be able to tell you right away. We have some local growers that do actually grow container plants. So the reason for this is that the plant actually gets used to an area. They get used to the weather, the climate. But if it's actually a seedling source from this area, then it's going to be even better because it will be the child basically of trees that actually developed and evolved into the climate that we have in this area. So those are just some things to keep in the back of your mind, but also be aware that you may wait a long time to actually find the tree that you want that was actually grown in this area. So you may or may not be able to succeed in that mission. So here we're looking at a couple of trees. And I don't know if you all are able to see, you probably can see this very well, but the tree on the left has what we call a split leader. The tree on the right is a nice single leader. So this tree, I'm going to guess, might be 10, 12 years old, 15, definitely older than 5. But the problem originates back to when it was in its nursery days. The tree on the left with the split leader is very structurally unsound. Now, there's some issues that are going to come into play, maybe already are, certainly will before too long with this tree. It has something called bark inclusion, and basically just think about that as included, so that the bark of the trunk on the left is included with the bark on the limb on the right, to where basically there's no bark in there anymore. So trees depend on bark for their musculoskeletal system, and when you take it away, they're unstable. So what you have there is a fissure right in that V where that trunk comes together. And when it was younger, it wasn't such a big deal. You may have had codominance with those two stems to where the tree couldn't make up its mind which one was going to be the leader. And it should have been trimmed off back in its nursery days, back before it was 5 years old, but someone didn't do it. Something happened, and that branch was allowed to stay. When it was little, it was maybe the size of a pencil, but as both of them grew, they got fatter and fatter and fatter. Well, they didn't move out of the way of each other. So basically, it became like, instead of a finger, you have a couple of arms that grew together, and the bark just dissolves, you know, where those two came together. So that's a fissure. It's going to split. It might be wind do it. It might be a heavy ice load on the tree someday, but I can tell you, I'm looking at my crystal ball, and it's a matter of time for that tree. So do be careful when you're picking out your young tree. It makes a difference. So again, the principles of a strong structure are going to be one dominant trunk, like you see on the right, strong branch unions. If you look at the tree on the right, we have nice wide angles on all of those branches, so you know they've got good, strong branch unions. In that tree on the left, that V does not have a strong branch union. And the other thing to look for is a balanced canopy. So I don't really see a problem particularly with either one of these trees as far as their canopy goes. But these are the things that you're looking for. Okay, so looking again at these codominant stems and bark inclusion, you can see a little better with a close-up. If you look at again, the tree on the right, you see where, if you look right where that first crease is at the top and then down below, you see like a diamond shape that looks like a brown, I know I have a pointer, I just don't know where it is here, but sorry. Anyway, that's where the inclusion is taking place, where you can really see it from that sort of brown diamond shape straight down. Look at that sort of a sort of a wrinkly groove. There's a couple of things happening here. You can see there's bark missing underneath your brown diamond, but you also see kind of a cord-like structure. Well, what's happening there is the tree is trying like anything to heal that wound, and it can't do it. So it's callousing over that area, but it can't heal that wound. It can never do it. So those are what you look for when on a tree where you suspect bark inclusion, is exactly that sort of a setup. Okay, this photo looks like a healthy bushy tree, but what we're wondering here is, where is our central leader? So these trees were headed back by the nursery staff to promote bushy growth, and this is a type of maple. They wanted a rounder tree. Maple trees, those of you who are master gardeners and master naturalists, you've kind of studied this, and you know that maple trees have an opposite leaf orientation. In other words, the leaves, they're marching across from each other as you go up that leaf, or that stem, I'm sorry. But the maple tree is particularly troublesome if you start doing heading cuts, which you see on the right here. But what's going to happen is both of the buds are going to, that are underneath that cut, are going to go ahead and send out branches. And so what you end up with is a lot of branches. You get two of them. If it were alternate, then if you follow my reasoning, you would have a branch maybe sticking off to the right, and then a little further down you'd have maybe one to the left. But what's happening is you get a lot of branches in a very tight contained place. And there's ways that you can alleviate that, but it takes time, and most of your typical homeowners won't realize or do it until it's too late. So it's not unusual to see 10 or 15-year-old established trees. This is a type of Japanese maple that have multiple large limbs coming from the trunk in one spot and not in a good spot. So this leads to a poor structure. It wasn't natural. It was created by man intervention, and it leads to a poor structure. So when you are pruning a young tree, you want to prune for shape, and you want to prune for strength. So when this tree was very young, it wasn't pruned correctly, and it has a future that will not be good if it's not corrected. So do work on these when they're younger. So we're going to address the planting options that we have to plant something beyond the red maple. Red maple is very popular in this area. It's a hard maple, and there's nothing in the world wrong with it. Sometimes I feel like maples get, maybe they get a bad rap because of some of the problems that are happening with the silver maple and in naturalist type situations. But the red maple is a good tree, but it's not an easy tree to grow. So what we're suggesting here is maybe we could plant something besides red maple and think about that. So they're very popular, the maples. Particularly, we've had a problem. We've lost some major shade trees, and people just don't know what to do, what to plant. And the ash tree, I don't know if you all have noticed, but the ash trees have always had a problem with borers. But the emerald ash borer has been a particularly bad problem, and I'm seeing more and more dead ones. I'll be driving down the road, and I know what an ash looks like without its leaves, so I can tell that there's just lines of them, rows of them now that are dying. And the oak trees have always been fantastic, but now so many of them are getting this problem with the the wasp galls that have caused issues with their structure. And it's just been hard to find a good tree that we can grow. I know Gordon did a talk on beneficial insects and some of the problems, and we learned a little bit about the beneficials. Well, insects can be a blessing and they can be a curse. And for the most part with your trees, there's a lot of borer problems that we just don't want to get into. So this is a list of plants that you might consider that maybe you hadn't thought of. The first one is the amelanchier or the serviceberry. It's a small tree. It's a beautiful tree. It's in the apple family and has beautiful fruits. I can find no fault with the serviceberry, but it's not, people don't think of it very much to plant. You can find them where they've been, again, pruned for a single strong leader, or sometimes you find them where they are a more of a multi-stemmed habit. And depending on where you're going to put it, you may want one or the other. I'm getting a notice that my internet connection's unstable. So Chris, be on the ready just in case. The Kentucky coffee tree, I love this tree. It's large. It gets its name from the fact gymnocleidos actually means good branch. And dioicus, that goes back to the fact that it's got male trees and female trees. It's very prolific. So if you get a female tree, be aware that you're going to probably have little starts of Kentucky coffee trees coming up around your yard. If possible, it's good to get a male, in my opinion, but to each his own. Some people enjoy the beans and so forth. It doesn't get a noticeable skeletal structure until it's much, much older. It has a really large, complicated leaf, which gives you lots of shade, but in the wintertime, its name may lead you to understand that it's going to be naked, the naked branch then in the winter. But it is very easy to grow. It'll tolerate bad soil. And they have included the witch hazels as far as a smaller tree, large shrub. This is a native. It gives you a lot of interest throughout the seasons. Personally, if I was going to plant a witch hazel, this is one place where I love native trees, but I think I'd go for one of the cultivars that they've developed because they have some that the flower on the witch hazel is subtly beautiful, but the native is almost too subtle, but they have some really pretty ones that they've come up with, and they still are natives. They've just been selected out for something that's just a little more showy. And then in moving into the shade trees, the tulip tree is a fantastic native tree. It grows large. It has a nice straight trunk. Really interesting flowers. And the leaves, if you've seen them, they kind of, everything about it kind of looks like a tulip, which is where it gets its name. Word of caution, this is a tree that needs to be staked. I used to laugh, you know, driving around, you could always spot the tulip trees from a distance because they were always leaning. And that's because they don't have a terribly fibrous rooted system, and it takes them a while to get rooted in. And so when they're first getting established, the wind comes along and kind of blows them a little sideways, and people don't stake them back straight up until they can get their roots established, and then they just kind of stay that way and turn into a leaning tree. So we don't want that to happen, but good tree, easy to grow, and very, very pretty. And black gum, not to be confused with sweet gum, which would be liquidambar styraciflua for your scientific name. This is Nyssa sylvatica, unquestionably one of the most wonderful trees that we have of our natives. It is beautiful, slow growing, an electric red fall color, and I just can't say enough about the black gum. It does have a growth habit similar to what we see with some trees. We call it the pin oak growth habit. And basically, if you stand in the middle of the black gum and look up from the bottom up through the top of that tree, it's going to look like the spokes of a wheel. and which also is an easy way to identify it. But when you look at it from a distance, it has that habit where the top branches sweep up, the middle ones are kind of horizontal, and then the lower ones are basically sweeping down to the ground. So if any of you have ever had a tree of that sort, you'll know that it's hard to keep those bottom branches limbed up to where they don't knock you off your lawnmower. So just be aware if you plant this tree that you're going to have to work on limbing those lower branches up, so that if you plan to mow under that tree. Now, into the planting process. The first 20 minutes of your tree's life in your yard will determine if it will survive the next 20 years. And usually we can go back to when that tree was planted to determine if everything was done correctly, and problems that that tree runs into down the road can be directly taken back to that first 20 minutes when you plant the tree, if you can plant a tree in 20 minutes. I cannot. But I know we've talked some about this in naturalist and in master gardening classes. And I want to stress this again, because I can't say enough how important it is to plant your tree at its proper depth. My first arboriculture teacher, I remember him saying that you're better off, your tree's going to be better off if you plant it on top of the ground than to plant it too deep. So in other words, if you just took that tree out there and just laid it on the top of the ground in its ball or whatever, it would probably send some roots down into the ground and survive, and probably would still be there for years to come. But this tree that was planted too deep will not make it. Now, what they're showing here is the trunk flare. So if you look at any tree, you're going to see that the trunk is not just like a pencil stuck in the ground. It actually, a properly planted tree is going to show this flaring at the base of the tree. And all of the trees have this. You know, it's got a trunk, it flares, and then the roots begin to come out. So that needs to be either at the soil surface or above the soil surface. So unfortunately, sometimes you get a new tree in a pot where it was planted too deep in the pot. And so you come along and you think, well, all I have to do is just put the plant the tree so that the level of the soil that it's going into is the same as the level of the pot. But in actual fact, the tree is too deep in the pot. So you have to get that thing out of there, and without disturbing the roots too much, you're going to have to kind of push that dirt away until you find that root flare and plant that so that it's either at the soil surface or at the even up a little above the soil surface is better than getting it too deep. So investigate your root ball before you start digging your hole, because if you're not careful, you'll get your hole too deep, and you want to know what you're up to. Don't be afraid to take a yardstick or a ruler out. Nobody's going to laugh at you. So pictured here is a young tree that was planted in a parking lot island. So there's lots of issues with this tree, but when we excavate it, at the base of the trunk, what do you think we're going to see? When I look at it, to start with, I can see that it does in fact look like a pencil has been stuck in the ground. Can you all see that if you look down at the base of the tree? So I'm going to show you a close-up of what this tree looks like. So if you look at the dark portion of that trunk, right about in here, you can see the level at where that tree was planted, and you see how deep it was. Here is the root flare down here, and here is how deep it was planted. So how deep do you plant the hole? Well, um, conventional wisdom has been recommending shallow and wide as the rule for the planting hole. So since most of the roots stay at the top foot of soil, it's not important to dig a super deep hole. In other words, what we have are what's called feeder roots that actually come out of this area of that. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. If I can go back. I don't think I can. Well, I'll just, we know what that looked like. I'm just going to leave it where it's at. I'm afraid I'll just keep going forward. I apologize. I'm having a little trouble with my mouse pad today. But if you dig that hole so it's kind of shallow on the sides, and then loosen the soil widely all around that shallow area, and then you'll end up setting your tree ball at the correct depth in that hole, and then realize that you don't want to rough that soil up too much because you don't want your tree to sink later. So you can kind of scratch that soil up a little bit. It will help later on with the water percolation down through that soil, but you don't want to do too much because once you dig that soil up, it's really hard to get it back where it needed to be. And as a precaution on heavy soils, they actually recommend planting the tree a couple of inches high in order to be sure that you won't inadvertently have that tree sink down lower. So there's some issues here in our tree planting that we could probably talk for 2 hours about, but I'm just going to sum up what I have found is that you want to keep your tree planted a little high. And the other reason for that is that most people want to come in later and do some mulching. So if your tree's already up just a little high, then it'll help to correct some of the problems that we sometimes run into with over mulching. So now here we see a tree where they're going to well, what we want to do now is talk about the problem with the trunk bark. And as I said before, that is actually part of the skeleton of that tree, and the bark of a tree does a lot for that tree. It's a breathing, live part of that organism that has got to be cared for carefully. So that having been said, the trunk's bark is very vulnerable to soil-related problems and wetness than root bark is. So I've said a lot there. We've got trunk bark and we've got root bark. So root bark is different than trunk bark, but it also needs to be able to breathe and is a living type of organism, but it has a different function because its purpose relates back more to bringing oxygen in through the soil water, and the trunk bark is bringing in oxygen through the air. So there's a couple of major differences there between these two types of bark. So what happens with that tree is if it does settle deeper into the soil, then it's going to take trunk bark and get it in a water situation. And this often causes failure with a tree. So it probably is not something that most people think about. I can remember being off in my Cub Scout days and having to give boys talks about beating up tree trunks because people don't seem to realize how important bark is on a tree. But in this case, if you have the bark to rot out where that red arrow is pointing, if that bark rots out all the way around that tree, then it's going to definitely compromise its ability to transport water and nutrients up and the carbohydrates down through that stem. So plant in a shallow hole to avoid settling and getting your trunk buried in the soil. There's a lot of disagreement on this. I have been part of a tree nursery in my lifetime, and I really am, I can see both ways on this subject, but I'm just going to say that some burlap lasts longer than other burlaps. In our day, we couldn't keep burlap on a tree long enough to get it out of the nursery and planted. But there's also rot-proof burlaps that will last a very long time. So it depends on the burlap. And so what's happening is the nurseryman on a balled and burlap tree has wrapped that tree with burlap in order to stabilize it. You do not want to rough your ball up with a tree. I've seen this happen where people will grab a hold of a tree trunk and drag it and try to get it where it needs to be. And basically what you're doing is you're shaking the roots. You're basically shaking the roots off of that tree ball to where it's going to jeopardize its ability to live. So the nurseryman does things. They wrap the tree in burlap, and then they'll put these wire baskets on in order to stabilize it until it can get planted. So there's a problem with the wire cage that is very commonly put around the tree. And if you look closely, right about in this area, can you see where that wire has actually stayed around the trunk of that tree and not rusted away? The nurseryman thinks that cage is going to rust away, basically. And the smarter ones, when they go in and plant that tree, they cut that wire away so that all of these circles at the top of this cage are broken. So that's what they do. They literally go in there with wire cutters after they get the tree in place, planted, and they cut that away. So if you're having someone come in and plant one of those trees, or if you're doing it yourself, do be aware that you do need to deal with this wire that's particularly at the top of this cage. It's true, it's already starting to rust. In time, it will rust away, but probably not quick enough before that tree gets some caliper there. And when I say caliper, I mean it's getting bigger around, and it's going to run into that, and it's going to end up girdling that tree. So deal with the wire cages, and if it's been over burlapped, you can actually get in there with a Stanley knife, and you can actually cut that burlap at the top of that ball and kind of cut that and get that away once it's in the hole. But remember that is there just for the stability of that tree, and that it needs to be there until the tree is planted. But you do not want to leave burlap sticking out of the ground. It will act like a wick and will take the water out of the ground anyway. So think about getting that burlap away from your balled and burlap tree after it's planting. Now, next we're going to talk about mulching. We're getting back into that gray area of planting too deep when we talk about some of this mulch. The rule is to apply it 2 to 4 inches deep and apply it as wide or wider than the planting hole. Well, the reason for this is that your tree has what's called a drip line, and if you look at the canopy of that tree, it's going to extend a few inches beyond where you see branches. So when a new transplant is put in the ground, what you're wanting to do is approximate the size of, if you look up basically at that circle, kind of a circle, if you look down a bird's eye view at that tree, you want to have your mulch as wide as that canopy's circle, plus 2 or 3 inches wider. That's going to help a lot with moisture retention, and studies have shown that trees that have been mulched really do a lot better, in that first critical 1, 2, 3 years when they're getting established. Now, this hurts people that want to really have a tidy looking tree on their lawn. they want to put this mulch up around this stem because darn, that looks pretty. But going back to what we just talked about, if we go ahead and put this mulch up around the base of this tree, covering up its root flare. Now, I don't have to tell you what we're doing. We're going to cover up tree bark. We're going to make it so that it can't get any oxygen. We're going to subject it to water problems, and it's going to think that it's been planted too deep, basically. The tree doesn't know the difference between this mulch and dirt, or soil, I'm sorry. Think about that. And they say a good rule of thumb is to think like you're making a bagel and not a muffin. So what you don't want to do is build this volcano up around this tree. You want to basically keep that mulch away from the trunk of the tree, and then go ahead and put it out here around the root zone where it'll do some good. It's not going to do any good up there anyway, so it looks pretty, but it's not good for the tree. And here they're agreeing, no volcanoes. So this I'm sure you've heard it, the volcano of death. Basically looking like a pencil stuck in the ground. The root flare, I don't know where it is. It's under here somewhere. If you pile it high, it's going to cut off that oxygen to the root system and lead to stem rot. If you don't know what stem rot looks like, well, here's a good example of it on your right here, where basically your tree just rotted off and fell over. And on the subject of moisture, if you have a wet area where you're going to be planting anyway, find a tree that's tolerant of wet areas, and you will do much better in the long run, avoiding things like root rot and stem rot. Organic mulches are beloved. You can see the list of pluses that we find when we use an organic mulch. It stops the moisture from evaporating from the soil. It can reduce weed growth, insulate the soil surface, helps to recycle nutrients, because there are actually some nutrients in that organic type mulch. And this can be good or bad depending on where they're at in their breakdown, but generally speaking, they will ultimately lead to structure in that soil, producing things like humus. And so you can read this list and think about those advantages. A study that was conducted by the University of Arizona showed that oak trees that were amended with mulch, they had 25% more roots and 40% greater trunk circumference compared to unmulched trees. So basically, we do like to mulch our trees. We just need to be careful not to over mulch, and they should be applied to the root zone again. Even if it's an inorganic mulch, you want to stick to that maybe 3 to 6 inch rule. And generally that newly transplanted tree circumference is going to come in around 3 to 6 feet around from the trunk. When you are mulching, if you've already used an organic mulch and you're coming along to freshen it up, do pay attention to how much mulch is already there. Most people contribute to the volcano of death by just adding more and more mulch every year when they freshen it up. So kind of pay attention to how much mulch is there. And if you've already got 3 inches of broken down mulch that isn't looking very pretty, then you need to take some of that off before you put 2 to 4 inches more on there. So we're not just going to keep adding 2 to 4 inches of mulch every year. We're going to actually consider how much mulch is there. You can get mulches. There's a nice one called Beauty Bark that's been dyed brown, and they do stay looking better longer. So if you use a mulch like that to begin with, you won't feel that need to be constantly putting on a new mulch because it still looks good. So something to think about. Now, tree wrapping is a controversial subject. It's done around here for the most part to prevent damage from deer coming in and rubbing their new antlers on them. But to me, a more dire problem is sun scald. Back to that red maple, that tree has such a delicate bark, really up until those trunks get to be 4 or 5 inches before they actually start to fissure and make actual bark. So we call that a skin. And if you've ever tried to grow a red maple, what'll happen will be it will develop these splits that go straight down the trunk. And that's happening because in the spring, what'll happen will be the sun kind of on those warm days will shine on that trunk and kind of warm up that cell sap, and it all sort of runs out of the cells. And then the sun goes down, it gets cold again and freezes. And so that cell sap will just burst that trunk. And when that happens, it's hard for the tree to heal it, and you get different kinds of insects that are opportunistic that will come in there and try to get in that crack. So to me, that's a good reason to, to wrap a tree. Usually what most people don't understand though is you don't leave those on all year long. So fall and then take them off before the spring growth starts. So there's different types available. They've listed the crepe paper. I see the plastic spiral wraps quite a bit. Plastic sheath, hardware cloth, different things. But just be aware if you're trying to grow some types of maples that have that thin-skinned bark, and other trees that have the thin-skinned bark, then the tree wrapping is going to be important. But put it on in the fall, take it off in the spring. If you don't, you'll start to get problems with insects can get trapped under there, or the tree just doesn't develop right. It needs its bark again. Remember, the tree bark needs that oxygen, so it needs to be out there in the air where it can kind of move and get some sunlight and air. But it's a preventative thing. Put it on in the fall, take it off in the spring. Staking, again, is done to prevent blowovers on windy sites, or sometimes to protect your tree from vandals and mowers. But don't stake a tree unless there's a reason to stake it. So it's not something that you do just because you planted a tree. And if you do stake it, it's recommended that you take it off, the staking away, after one season of growth. Its purpose is to keep that tree up straight. And the tree is like a muscle. It needs to move around. It needs to shift in the wind and all of those things to gain caliper. Again, that's the fatness of that trunk. So if you prevent that from happening, you'll just get a kind of a spindly and skinny tree, and we don't want that. Now, if you put your tree in, like your tulip tree we talked about, and it still hasn't rooted in, some of them can be shy. Take it off. If you see that it's wanting to shift again, then you can stake it back. But that would be the only reason that you would want to leave a stake after 1 year. So this tree was staked. It's been staked. It's been left there for years. And when eventually, they told us in this picture that when they took the the stake away, see, you've got these guy wires that are tying it down to one of those little dog tie downs over here somewhere, which is good, a good way to stake a tree. But they said that when they took these off, it actually flopped down into this alley here. So that's what you'll get sometimes if you just leave a tree staked. Watering is important. Not watering is the #1 cause of transplant failure. So for a newly planted tree, consider the first 2 years as the establishment period, and you need to water deep, and you need to water at least once a week, unless you're in a rainy season, and then you can kind of slack off from that. But remember that our soil sometimes has a hard time taking the water, taking the moisture. So what you need to do is, when you plant that tree, develop a saucer around it so that when you water, it will hold the water and then it can percolate down. Or use some kind of drip irrigation or trickle irrigation, or one of these, they call these gator bags. And these are fantastic because they are like a type of drip trickle type irrigation, where you fill this bag with water and there's little holes all over the bottom, so it lets the water out slow. And that is a great idea in our climate with our soil, because when clay soil gets dry, it is very dry. You know, when it gets wet, it's very wet. So you need to keep all of this in mind. You know, when you come in the spring and the soil's very wet after the winter, well, you don't want to be putting more water on it. You got to kind of let that start to dry out. But then when it does dry out, it's going to be very dry. So these gator bags, or some kind of trickle irrigation, or using a saucer, some way so that you can get that water deep, to go deep. So do you remember the drought of 2012? I know I've got a master naturalist friend. We were just talking about it the other day. That was Steve Moddert. And there are still trees that are suffering from the drought of 2012. Trees are very slow to get where they're going, and when they've been injured, sometimes it takes them a while to die. So be aware that when you're assessing the health of your tree, when you see limbs are dying back on that tree, you may have to kind of get in that Wayback Machine and think about what was going on 3, 4, 5 years ago. And then you're going to remember that something did happen that caused a problem with that tree. And they don't die necessarily right away. It can take a tree, they said, up to 10 years for a tree to actually die. So it's important, particularly to watch the weather, and there's not much you can do for a large established old tree. They're able, for the most part, to deal with most problems that come along with weather. They will go into a quiescent state, which means that it's kind of like dormancy, but it's more like they just go into a suspended animation until the whatever it is passes, and then they sort of resume their growth. Whereas dormancy is more of a natural way to overwinter, basically. But quiescence can happen, and you just need to pay attention to those new transplants and give them extra water if you see something like this happening. And with your evergreens, sometimes evergreens have been planted that really were too far south for them. They preferred a cooler climate, and just be aware that an evergreen, it varies from evergreen to evergreen, but they're open for business 24/7, 365 days a year. So they can only go so many days with a protracted high temperatures, like over the hundreds, before it's going to deliver a death blow to them. So they may die. Some of your spruces, certainly firs that you might be growing here. When we get into these extreme hot temperatures, you may find that they will run into trouble. So drought situations can be devastating to trees. And the symptoms that you're going to see are slow, reduced growth. They become more susceptible to insect infestations and diseases. You may see dieback on some of the branches, or overall the tree. Or you might see the problem manifesting next year. So Again, the new plantings and the conifers just can't go into the winter with that kind of drought stress. So if you've had a drought, pay close attention to the water. It's going to make a big difference. Also, I would like to add that to a tree, winter drought is as bad as a summer drought, and that's where you haven't watered a new transplant going into the winter. So what you want to do is make sure you've got water around those roots going into the winter, lest they fall prey to something that is like a freeze-drying situation. Deadwood in an established tree might go unnoticed for a long period. In the summertime, you see missing bark. Any branch that's larger than 4 feet or more in length or 2 inches or more in diameter is considered dangerous. Broken and hanging branches. You should have these addressed by a certified arborist who will come in and assess that plant and remove those. We call them widow makers back in the old days. But it's because they can fall in a storm and they can be very, very dangerous if left unchecked. Some of the things that you might look for in an established tree that are indicators of rot or decay or structural weakness. If you see mushrooms and lichens and so forth, they can mean different things. But generally speaking, a fungus feeds on dead or rotten plant material. It doesn't feed on the healthy part. So if you see a hollow tree or a cavity in a tree like this with a lot of mushrooms and things around it, that can be a sign that you may have a problem with that tree. I'm not to say that you definitely do, but you just need to be aware that once 40% of a structure is lost, a tree is in danger of falling. So you can't see always what's going on in that tree, same goes with these splits, cracks, and lightning scars. You just don't know. And what you should do is have that tree evaluated by a certified arborist. With our own extension, we have people that can help you find those arborists if you're not sure where to find one. So feel free to reach out and see if they have any ideas of someone that you could have come in to evaluate your plant. The root zone of the tree, as we said earlier, goes beyond the canopy, and the tree roots will spread 3 to 5 times the extent of that circle that the canopy makes. So you need to think about what is going on within that root zone or nearby. Trees in an urban setting have an average lifespan of 8 years, and this is due mostly to the fact that urban areas are not very hospitable to trees, and they die because of poor planting, human error, lack of resources like soil volume. So this tree is not healthy. What you need to do is check at the base of the tree, look for circling roots. No one's really sure why, but when a tree is in distress, or particularly when it's been planted too deep, it responds by sending out roots that circle around the tree. No one knows why. They've asked the trees, they're not answering that question, but it is a sign that something is wrong. And so be aware if you see circling roots, that's going to be a sign of a problem. Leaf size and color can be an indicator. If you know what a normal leaf looks like, that's fine. But if you start seeing smaller leaves, yellowish leaves, they can be a sign that there's a nutrient deficiency, some kind of environmental stress, something wrong with the way the tree's growing. It's not able to develop as it should. Maybe some kind of chemicals that have been sprayed nearby. You just don't know. But do be aware that there are actually trees that have yellowish leaves. For instance, this is a catalpa tree, and its tree is naturally yellow, so you can't always assume that that chlorosis is a sign of something wrong. ginkgo trees also tend to be a little bit on the yellow side. If you're wondering if your tree's growing enough, you can look at these terminal bud scale scars. These happen on all of the branches, and basically they look like, I think they look kind of like a ring with some little sort of horizontal stripes on it. But that comes out every year and shows you how much growing that tree did after the terminal or the end bud came out, leafed out, and the tree started growing. So if you look down that stem, it's going to tell a story. You'll see those going back along the stem, really back to when that branch began to grow. So if you see some problems there where they start, those lengths get shorter and shorter and shorter, sure, there may be a problem there. Maybe not. They can vary from year to year depending on the weather and what's going on in the overall climate, but they can be an indicator. Just be aware that that's what those are. And here's another picture where you can see those terminal scars going on down that branch. So here's actually this year's growth that we're seeing on this, looks like a beech, or maybe, no, it's a maple of some sort. Annual trunk growth. So here we're seeing some lichens growing on the side of this tree. So a way of determining annual growth, they say, is to just look at how many lichens are accumulating. The lichens don't necessarily cause a problem. Be aware that they are part of the natural process. But sometimes on old trees, you begin to see a lot of them along with this moss. And also on the subject of shade trees and grass, be aware that for a shade tree, their biggest competitor is actually turf grass. And people really, really, really want to have a lot of grass and trees. The two things kind of are counterindicated toward each other, but they did mention, and I thought this was interesting in this presentation, that once they removed a lawn around a tree, that the tree root growth increases by 195%. Now, removing lawn, a word of caution, you can't go start digging out a lawn around a tree because that's where your feeder roots are. So I'm definitely not advocating that, but they're just saying that you just need to be aware that your turf grass may be impeding the growth of your tree. Here's a couple of pictures. We see this one on the left a lot. This is drought stress. So it's not uncommon when you get into those droughty seasons to see this happening with a leaf. But there's something else that can happen. Over here on the right, we see bur oak blight. And this picture, I can't really zoom in on it, but generally speaking, what you'll start to see is some what they call water marking, where on the edges of this, it'll sort of fade out on a tree that is actually infected with a bacterial type infection. You see here, these are nice square lines that we're seeing on this maple. But over here on this bur oak, this tree is having a problem where it's having trouble with getting water and nutrients out to that tree in a systemic way out to those leaves. So those are two different things. Just be aware that this may be a natural response to drought, or it may be something worse. So this would be abiotic, this is biotic. In other words, I'm not sure what causes the bur oak blight, I'll be truthful, but a lot of times they're caused by bacterial infections. It might be a viral infection, so just be aware. So I know we've seen a lot of trees on our own, and any picture I would have come up with today, I think we've pretty much already seen. So that concludes the presentation. I'd like to give credit to these nice people, Candace Hart, she's fantastic, and Ryan Pankow, who helped put together this presentation for us today. And if you want more information, here's where you can go.
Thank you so,
all right, Chris.
Thank you so much. Is there any questions? If you guys would like to put them in the chat box, or you can unmute now.
This is Beth Meyer. I have a question.
Sure. Hi,
Oh,
Beth.
hi. In the last issue I got of Gateway Gardener, on the first page, there's an advertisement for tree and shrub systemic insect drench. It's supposed to drench the soil around the tree and it'll prevent emerald ash borer. And I've never heard of that before. Is that a new thing, or does it really work? It's you put it on the soil.
Drenches, that's not a new idea, to drench the soil, and then what happens in a case like this, it's a systemic type chemical, and the idea is that the tree will take that up through its roots and then spread it out through basically all through its branches, through its roots, through its branches, in its trunk, out to its leaves. So in theory, that should work. I mean, I can't contradict what they're saying, but anytime you use a product like this, you need to follow the directions on the label. And I can tell you my personal experience. I was very excited on I was pretty excited about the Japanese beetle. I actually did this with an existing shade tree. I spent a lot of money on this product, and I tried it. It didn't do a thing for those. But I think what you need to realize is soil varies, and the ability of that water to percolate. You know, you mix it in the water, you drench the soil. It's got to get to the roots. The roots have got to get it up through the tree. I mean, it's a lot of that's timing when you do it. In theory, I don't know why that wouldn't work if you could get it to work, if you could get it up into that tree. That's just my opinion.
I could try it. We have one ash tree that's still alive.
So there was a hand raised by, I believe, Susan Kelly, so she'll want to make a comment on this. It'd be interesting to know what the active ingredient is in the product you're referring to. Bayer makes a product that I know a lot of people have used over the years, and it is a systemic insecticide, and maybe that's what Sarah used for her.
That is what I used. It's the imidacloprid. That is exactly what I.
Because once you have a certain size trunk, you know, it's applied by how big your trunk is. So I'd be interested in knowing what your chemical is. And then was that Susan Kelly? Did you have a
Yes. Yes, I have a question. Not about this particular question, but I have my own question.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead. I just want to make sure that
I have a redbud tree, and it's done very, very well. I planted it 2 summers ago. This morning, however, I had one of those branches that broke off. The whole diameter of the trunk is about an inch, inch and a half at the widest part. I now have a big scar where I cut the limb off that fell. Do you recommend that I wrap that this winter, since it's on it's on the east side of my house, exposed to the east sun?
So you're saying that the branch broke off. Did you prune it then, or did you just leave it?
No, it was on the ground. It needed to be off.
I mean on the trunk. Did you do anything to the trunk?
Not yet. I left about a ½ inch of tissue.
Okay, well, as far as pruning goes, what you might do is go ahead, if you can, kind of smooth that. It's probably a ragged break, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So what you want to do is stay outside the branch collar. That's kind of that wrinkly place. And usually you come out maybe, I'm going to say, like on a tree that small, it might be half an inch, you know. So look outside there and then cut that off and even it up. And the best thing you can do is take some kind of an insecticide and just sort of paint that on that wound, leave it out in the air where it can breathe. What usually happens with those wraps is you end up trapping insects or diseases. I said insecticide, but insecticide, fungicide, you know, to kind of help stop anything from coming in there and attacking that tree while that wound.
Because it's into the heart tissue. It's broken halfway off.
Well, again, if you can clean it up, you know, make it so that it's not or as least ragged as you can make it, and then paint it with some kind of an insecticide or a and a or fungicide, just to keep any opportunistic pests from getting in there. But it's better to leave that out in the air, leave it in the open, and the tree will do its best.
Okay. I just wondered about winter time, since you were talking about the sun scalding and stuff, if that was going to be a problem with it.
Well, it won't make that problem any worse. Back in the old days, we used to you'd take a sharp knife, and you might try this around that area where it broke off, and be very, very careful when you do this, because I don't want you to cut yourself or something. But basically, it's like you will take your knife and cut into that, just, cut perpendicular into that bark, just so that you cut just to where the bark starts there, and just make a circle around that broken off area. And what'll happen it'll be easier for that tree to callus that over.
Okay.
Because it's really hard for a tree to make a callus on a jagged wound, and so that'll make it easier to heal that scar, basically. But be careful when you do it.
Okay, sure. No, it was totally pertinent today to our tree discussion. It was like, how perfect could this be? And then I've got this question. So, all right, thank you.
It just happened.
Thanks for the question.
Deanna Rotterman also asked, is anyone seeing oak trees losing leaves earlier than normal this year?
I have not seen that, but then I haven't been looking. Are you seeing that, Deanna?
Yes, I have an old tree, and for a couple years, I know, it's been seeing a few limbs drop here and there, but for the most part, it's stayed pretty healthy looking. And I've just noticed for the last probably the last 3 or 4 weeks, like I have a lot of leaves falling. They're half brown, half green. And usually that tree in years past has been the last tree to lose all their leaves.
Well, what kind of an oak is it, Deanna? Do you know?
I think it's a pin oak, but it does not have gauze. But it's of the the red oak family.
Okay. The reason I'm asking is red oak, and it is in the that whole family, that with the kind of spiny oak leaf tips. For those of you who don't know, there's the white oak group, and then there's the red oak group. But red oak does have a problem with a bacterial blight, so that's why I was trying to figure out what kind of tree we're talking about here. But what that looks like, any type of a bacterial type infection in an oak tree, what you're going to see is they leaf out fine in the spring, but then as the season progresses, it'll be like a branch, start with one branch and then maybe 2 branches, where you'll start seeing, it looks like that. Remember when we looked at the diseased leaf, the oak tree? Well, that's what you see, you see that brown just going kind of down those leaves, and the whole branch will be brown. But here's the thing, Deanna, if the tree can drop the leaf, it's alive. Dropping a leaf, it's not like a tornado comes along and rips them all off. Well, sometimes they do, I guess, but it's an active process. So if the tree is shedding a leaf, it's doing it. It's there. When you have a tree that is sitting there going into winter, the type of tree that was supposed to drop its leaves and then it doesn't, that's trouble, because that means that something went wrong to where it couldn't drop them. So I don't know, maybe if you want, I could look at it sometime and we could see what we maybe think is wrong with that tree, if you want, because it could be a lot of things. There are some things out there for oaks that we do need to be concerned about, but some things they don't even know, like the oak wilt, they just can't figure out what exactly is causing that. So but I would say we've had a weird year. We had a lot of moisture. It was fairly cool, and then it dried out, got hot, and then it got cool and wet again, and then it dried out and got hot, and then we had wind, and so a lot of times those extreme conditions in the weather will cause trees to behave out of character, but they are really smart organisms, and usually they come back fine the next year. So.
All right. There's a comment on here from,
I'm sorry?
It was just,
go ahead, Deanna, if you're not done.
What
no,
was
I'm done. Thank you.
okay.
I was just going to make a comment about Jamie left a message for us. She did use it on the linden. I'm assuming she's referring to that Bear product. And it saved her tree because lindens are just, the Japanese beetle absolutely adore them. So, and so it saved her tree on using that. So systemics, if people don't know what those are, I think it was described earlier, it goes through the tree. But then when that Japanese beetle takes a couple bites, it kills the insect. So,
And Gail, to that, I would say my tree was a established large little leaf linden that I did it on. And it was, I spent quite a bit of money on that product because I was curious. It was like a scientific experiment, you know, but I think the smaller, the younger your tree is, it goes back to what Gail said a while ago. It's challenging to get that product up through a really, you know, large established tree. So if you've got a younger one, the younger the tree, I think the better the odds of something like that working. And one thing I like about it is that beetle pays for the crime, right?
yeah. You know, when the Japanese beetle first came out, we're talking, I don't even know exactly how many years now it's been, but the first thing you saw when you recognized something was going on in our area was along the highway, the lindens were completely turned brown from being laced up, and the foliage damage. That was the first I saw damage from that beetle. It was pretty significant that the linden was at the top of their list.
Can I say something on the subject of that? I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. It's imipachloride or that's the product that's there.
Right, exactly. I was waiting to hear that.
Say it. But anyway, I actually was using it to kill ants around my house, which worked. But I sprayed it on some evergreens that were having trouble with those bagworms, and it took care of them. So what happened then was, because it lasts for 3 months once it gets into the system, and these were small enough to where I could spray it on the foliage, and I was just curious to see what would happen. And it was labeled, you know, for bagworms, but I just hadn't really thought about it. But when they came out, if those of you that don't know how a bagworm works, they again, back to Gordon's, I think Gordon's talk, he talked about them a little bit, I think, but the worm's actually living in this structure that it makes, and it's sort of zooming around, eating up your evergreen, and meanwhile it's protected by this sort of armor-coated bag it built, you know, out of leaves and stuff. So you can't spray them and kill them. They're really hard to kill. But because I'd used this systemic on the evergreen, when that critter went out to eat the leaves, it killed them because it was in the tissue of the plant. So if you have a problem with bagworms, that's my tip for the day. Is those systemics can be really very, very helpful. You know, I'm not crazy about using pesticides, and by no means would I overdo them, but there's some things that are just so difficult. And when you try to use a contact type of insecticide, you end up using so much product that, you know, ounce for ounce, you're really, you're putting less of that out, you know, when you use a systemic.
I totally agree. I was kind of sitting here going to say the same thing. I'm not crazy about using very many chemicals, but if you were to try to spray any tree or tree canopy, you'd be using so much chemical, and the chances that it's only going to kill the things that it can contact with. So the systemic is just, it's one way of reducing the amount of chemicals.
But if you did need to spray the top of your tree, big trees, there's actually people out there that do that. There's professionals that can come with big rigs and do that. It's just that, you know, like Gail said, I'm a little squeamish about all of that. And there's some things like with a young tree, again, in that first 5 years, you can do a lot to help that tree get a good start and make it through a good life, you know, with the pruning for structure. And if there's problems that come up, like those doggone twig pruners, and that's one that I thought that's what you were going to say did happen to the redbud. Was a twig pruner, but they just go in there and they just cut your branches off, and it looks like somebody came in with a pruning shear. They do such a good job of it. They're nice and square. Or those cicadas that come in, and what they want to do is go and this insect appears after so many years, depending on which one it is, but that long-term cicada, they actually lay their eggs out on the tips of a branch, and then they come along and hope that those branch tips will fall off to the ground. So you end up with some awful problems happening with those little trees. And for a little tree, that's a big deal to have all your tips cut off, I'm telling you. You know, so with your little trees, you may have to take extreme measures to protect them from some of these things that can come along when they're in their baby stages.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for everything and all the time you've taken to answer questions. Is there any follow-up questions? I don't see any in the chat box. Does anybody else have a question before we let Sarah go?
Okay. Well, you've been
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.
All right. If you think of anything later, just, you know where to find me.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.